Today we are still going to be continuing Unit 12. We're going to be looking at a vertical shift or a midline. So let's look at the do now. The do now says the completely factored form of that is. Now I'm just going to rewrite this. So we have n to the fourth minus 9 n squared plus 4n cubed minus 36n minus 12n squared plus 108. Now that's a lot of terms. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 terms that we have, and we have to completely factor. When you have 6 terms, the only method you can use is grouping. So what we have to do is we need to group these terms in groups of 2. So I'm going to split them up in groups of 2. So now there's 3 groups. So in each of these groups, we are going to Gcf factor. So in the first one, our Gcf here is n squared. So we have to divide both of these by n squared. And we get n squared, and in parentheses, n squared minus 9. So those cross out. Now looking at the middle pair, we have 4n cubed and a 36n. So the GCF there is 4n. So when we factor out a 4n, we get n squared minus 9. Notice the 2 parentheses are the same. That means we're on the right track. We need all of the parentheses to be the same. So in this last one, if you were to find the GCF of 108 and 12, you'd find that it is 12. Now, what you have to be careful about here, though, is this number is negative. Since that is a negative, that tells us that our GCF is negative as well. So here we have negative 12 n squared minus 9. Now, all 3 of our parentheses are the same. That's how we know we completed this step correctly. So now what you do is you take all 3 of your parentheses that are exactly the same, and you only write it once. So n squared minus 9. Then what you do is you take your 3 GCFs, and we're going to combine those in its own parentheses. So our first GCF was n squared, the second was a positive 4n, and the third was a negative 12. So we put those in its own parentheses. Now it says completely factored. That means we're going to have to factor even further. So let's look at both of our parentheses. Let's first look at the red one. So in the red one, there are 2 terms, and there's a subtraction symbol in between them. That tells us we have to use dots. So to use dots, we have 2 sets of parentheses. One gets a plus, one gets a minus. To figure out what goes inside of them, you take the square root of both of your terms. So do this work on the side. Square root of n squared is n. So n goes in the front of our parentheses. And the square root of 9 is 3. So 3 goes at the end of our parentheses. Now let's look at the second parentheses. We have 3 terms. There's no number in front of n squared. That tells us that we have to use the AM method. So to use that, you have to find 2 numbers that multiply to negative 12, and those same 2 numbers have to add to 4. Those 2 numbers end up being Those 2 numbers end up being a positive 6 and a negative 2. So to write our answer, we have 2 sets of parentheses. We have our variable in the front, and then we just put our 2 numbers there. Our first was a positive 6, so we get a plus 6. The second was a negative 2, so it's a negative 2. And this right here is our completely factored answer. So the answer choice that has that is answer choice 2. Moving forward, we are going to talk about some of the vocabulary again. So amplitude is the vertical distance between the midline and one of the extremum points. So the extremum points, by that, talking about the min or the max. A vertical shift is what we're going to be looking at today. It's the translation of the graph up or down a certain number of units. Period is the horizontal length to complete one cycle. Now, in order to figure out the period, you need to know what a cycle even looks like. So, for a sine graph, you need to know that it starts at the midline, goes above, back to the midline, below, and then back to the midline. So it kind of looks like an S. Now for cosine, it starts above the midline, hits the midline, goes below, hits the midline, ends above. So you have to know how those two different functions work. And last, we have the frequency, which is the number of cycles the graph completes in a given interval. So again, knowing what sine and cosine looks like is really important to identifying that. So today we are going to be exploring vertical shifts, and the vertical shift you could see in the plus C. So if something is added on the outside of the parentheses, that is going to be your vertical shift. Now, yesterday we looked at what happens if you have a number in front of sine and cosine, and that's when you have your amplitude. So to graph, the first thing you're going to do is draw your midline at y equals c. And next you're going to go a units to the max and a units to the min. Now what's important is you know the pattern of the sine and cosine graph. So I do want to take a second to talk about that. So for the sine graph, let's say that this line is our midline. So how this graph works is it first starts at the midline. Then it goes above the midline to the max point. Then it goes back to the midline. Then it goes below to the minimum point. And then it goes back to the midline. Now, on the other hand, if we're looking at cosine, and here is our midline, the cosine graph, it starts above the midline, and then it hits the midline. Then it goes below the midline. Then it hits the midline, and it goes above the midline. So that's where this curved shape comes into play. So you need to know how to get from one point to the next for sine and cosine. You need to know that pattern. All right, so let's graph number 1, which is 2 cosine x plus 1. First question is, what is the equation of the midline? I'm going to start here because this is the first time we're seeing it. Notice there's a 1 added to the cosine of x. That tells us that our midline is at y equals 1. So y equals 1 is right here. Just going to label our graphs a bit. So I'm going to draw a line at y equals 1. And this will represent our midline. Okay? Next thing, let's look at the amplitude. So our amplitude is 2. That tells us that to get to the max point, you have to go 2 units up. So to get to max, two units above midline. And then to get to the min, you have to go 2 units below. Oh my goodness, sorry. Below midline. Okay, so we need to remember the pattern from the slide before. Since it's cosine, we start at our max. So at 0, our max, to get to it, we have to go 2 units above the midline. So let me just change the color here. See, it's pink. So you have to go 2 units above the midline. So we go up 1, 2 units. And then we go to the midline. And then we go to our minimum. So 2 units below the midline. So 1, 2. Then we go back to our midline. Then we go 2 units above. 1, 2. And this is one cycle of our cosine graph. You can go in the other direction if you like. So if we're going in the other direction, we started at the max. That means we go to the midline, then we go to the minimum, back to the midline, back to the max. So here would be our full cosine graph from negative 2 pi to 2 pi. So next question asks, what is the range? The range, just a reminder, those are your y values. We can either write it in a bracket or in function notation. We're going to do both. Our lowest point is our min, which is negative 1. Our highest point, which is our max, is 3. So that's the first way to write the range. The next way to write the range is negative 1, less than or equal to y, less than or equal to 3. Okay, let's look at another problem. It says to graph these 2 functions, then state the range for each of them. So let's first look at y equals 4 sine of x minus 2. First thing we have to plot is our midline. Our midline is at negative 2. So negative 2 is right here. Next thing, this is a sine, and our amplitude is 4. So when you have a sine graph, you start at your midline, and then you go to your max. To go to the max, we have to go up 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we go back to the midline. Then we go down 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we go back to the midline. So I'm just going to erase those dots that are there. And now we can connect. So it goes now up, then through the midline, down, and back to the midline. Okay, now you can go in the opposite direction as well. So here we start at the midline, that means we go down, then midline, then max, then midline. And the graph looks exactly the same. Okay, so that is our sine graph. Now let's look at our cosine graph. So I'll do that in blue. So here is our next graph. Our midline is at negative 3. I'm sorry, at positive 3. So we go up to positive 3 and we draw our midline. Now, there's something interesting about this one. We have a negative 2 in the front. Our amplitude here is 2, but that negative, that tells us something very important. It tells us to flip the graph. Okay, so what I'm going to do, which I find helpful, is I'm going to first just do it regular cosine. Okay, so I'm going to do the cosine graph without that negative, but I'm not going to connect any dots. I'm just going to make the dots. So if we were to do a regular cosine without the negative, our first point would be 2 above the midline. And then we would get to the midline, and then it would be 2 below. Then we would get to the midline, and it would be 2 above. Now, since it's negative, we have to flip the maximums and the minimums. So, our actual graph, instead of this point here, we're going to flip this to be below the midline. So I'm going to just erase that now. And we're going to do that for all the maximum and minimum points. The points that are on the actual midline, those don't change. But this point here, it should have been a min, but since we have the negative, it's going to be a max. So it becomes that point there. So I'm going to erase this one. And the same is going to happen to this point that's in that corner. It's going to be a min. So it's going to change. So I'm just going to erase that. Okay? So now we can connect it. Now we can use the same pattern along the other side. So then we would go to the midline, go above, go to the midline, go below. Now we did this again because there was that negative in front of the amplitude. So now let's look at the range. So the range for the sine graph, the minimum point here was that one, which is -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6. The highest point was that one, which is 2. Second way to write this is -6 less than or equal to y less than or equal to 2. Now looking at the cosine graph, the lowest point is going to be all the points that are along that line, which is 1. The highest point, which is around there, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Second way to write this is 1 less than or equal to y less than or equal to 5. Okay, let's look at another one. It says the graph below shows a sinusoidal curve of the form y equals a sine x plus c. Determine the values of a and c. So we need to figure out the amplitude and we need to figure out the midline. Now, remember, to find the midline, so to find c, so c is the midline, you take your max plus your min, and that does not look legible. And you guys know how OCD I am about my handwriting. So, anyway, you take your max plus, that's better, min, and divide it by 2. So our maximum point is 22. Our minimum point is 6. So we have 22 plus 6 divided by 2. 22 plus 6 is 28. 28 divided by 2 is 14. So C is equal to 14. Now, to find A, A is our amplitude. The amplitude, by definition, is the distance from your midline to your max or min. Okay? Now, we know our maximum and our minimum, and we know our midline. So what we have to do is just subtract the numbers. So to find A, you can take your max and subtract your midline. Or you can do your midline subtracted by the minimum, whichever you prefer. So our maximum point was 22. Our midline was 14. So that tells us that our amplitude is 8. Okay. All right, lastly, which of the following functions has a maximum value of 25? So now this is another slightly different problem. However, we are given the amplitude and we are given the midline. So we can use that. So let's first look at answer choice 1. So in answer choice 1, our midline is 12 and our amplitude is 25. So to get from the midline to the max, we would have to do 12 plus 25, and that gives us 37 as our max. That is not what we want. We want a maximum value of 25, so 1 does not work. Next, let's check answer choice 2. So in answer choice 2, our midline is 35. Now this is where you have to be careful. Our amplitude is 10. It is not negative 10. That negative is just when you flip your graph. It is not your amplitude. So to get to the max, we do 35 plus 10, which tells us that our max is 45. Again, not our answer because that is not what we want. So let's try answer choice 3. So our midline equals 17. Our amplitude equals 8. That was very sloppy. So to get to our max, we do 17, which is our midline, plus our amplitude. 17 plus 8 gives us a max of 25, so that is good. Now, if you were to check that last answer choice, you would be doing 15 plus 5, which is 20, not 25. Okay, so your check for understandings for this lesson. Again, in order to get credit for this lesson, you have to complete this check for understanding question. All right, guys, there's a second one. There's 2 questions you have to complete. And for this one, again, just show your work on a piece of paper and upload the picture onto Google Classroom. Thank you. Oh, what'd I do? Okay, thank you. Have a great day, everybody.